Today's top picks from Reuters Breakingviews. François Hollande needs to pay more than lip service to financial discipline, and Spain's banks need an insurance policy. With me now to discuss these stories is Reuters Breakingviews' Peter Tal-Larsen. Peter, you argue that the markets are too complacent about a probable Hollande victory. But the markets are surely right to think that not much is going to change in real terms.
Well, no, I think they're wrong. We think they're wrong. I mean, there are two explanations for the market's relaxed attitude coming into the first round of these elections. One is they think Sarkozy is going to get re-elected. That's very unlikely. Even though he will be neck and neck with Hollande in the first round, all the signs are that in the second round Hollande will win decisively. And the other explanation is that Hollande is going to, that the rhetoric that he's been embracing in the election campaign will not actually be matched by what he's going to do when he gets into power. And actually, we think that's wrong. This will be only the second socialist French president of the current republic. And the signs are really that the things that the markets should be worrying about, which are basically France's debt level and its commitment to spending and to fiscal discipline. Hollande doesn't really seem to. Not only does he not really seem to think that this needs to be addressed, he doesn't really seem to think that there's actually any kind of problem at all.
But presidential candidates, as we all know, they often say one thing to get into power. Once they're in power, reality bites, and what they do is not quite what they promised to do in the first place.
That's true, and obviously it's an old trick for new governments to come in and say, oh, things are much worse than we thought they were. I'm afraid all those promises will have to go out the window. But when you look at actually what's needed, I mean, Hollande is basically saying he's going to balance the budget by 2017, which is 1 year later than Sarkozy. And he's also talking about a 3%, sticking to within the sort of 3% fiscal limit. But the IMF forecast the other day was saying that the deficit was going to be 3.9%. Now, if you believe that, then the first thing Hollande would have to do on getting into power would be to implement a summer of austerity in order to get back in within that deficit limit. Given the euphoria that will surround the socialists as a result of the election, we think that's pretty unlikely. And you've also got to bear in mind that one of the big players in the election, or the other characters in the election, has been this far left candidate, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and Hollande is having to sort of tack in that direction in order to try and avoid losing supporters to the far left, and that will then bind his hands in terms of what he can do if and when he gets into government.
But France is bound by the EU, is bound by the fiscal discipline, the new programmes, the new agreements. He's not going to tear them up, is he?
Well, no, but he's going to. I mean, you know, the worry is, I think this is a real concern. The worry is that upon getting elected, Hollande will annoy either the markets or the rating agencies or Germany or all three in some kind of order. So there will be some sort of reckoning with the reality, but the idea that it's going to be a smooth ride, I think, is probably a bit naive.
Okay, and our next story, Spanish banks. You argue that Spanish banks need an insurance policy. Two questions jump out on this one. One, who is going to pay for it? Who's going to stand behind it? And two, how much are we talking about?
Well, yeah, the who's going to pay for it is the key question. I mean, the argument essentially is that Spanish banks, people are still worried about Spanish banks, even though they've recapitalized, they've consolidated, they've been forced to make very large provisions against their real estate exposures. Investors, they're still cut off from the wholesale markets. Investors still think it could get worse. So the way in which you can square this circle is by writing a disaster insurance policy, a bit like the UK government did with Royal Bank of Scotland in 2009, and say, okay, if losses get beyond a certain level, we will take those losses. The key
so
question
it's the government
then is,
that stands behind
well,
it.
the key question then is who, right? There are a couple of options. Spain has a deposit guarantee fund which brings in €2 billion a year. Some of those funds could be earmarked for covering potential future losses. The government could do a bit, but not very much. And really, in order to be credible, we think an insurance policy would need to be backstopped by the Eurozone. And that would mean using the European Financial Stability Facility, which is authorized to lend to governments for the purpose of recapitalizing banks. You could basically say, rather than lending the governments the money to stuff into the banks, you could provide an insurance policy to the governments, which could then be passed on to the banks. And that would have the advantage of not actually having to raise any money up front in order to cover this sort of worst case scenario, but would hopefully reassure the markets.
Well, with unemployment in Spain and bad debts in Spain rising, something has to be done pretty soon, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, but clearly, I mean, this is not the total solution to Spain's problems. I mean, even if you deal with them, a year ago, if you dealt with the banks, you might have actually taken some of the pressure off the sovereign. Now, if you deal with the banks, you still have this problem of what they do with the deficit, which, is another issue for them to deal with.
Okay, Peter, thank you. That's all for now. My thanks there to Peter Tal-Larsen. For more agenda-setting financial insight, watch our US Breaking Views show every day at 12:30 Eastern, that's 17:30 British Summer Time. I'm Jamie McGeever. This is Reuters.